Said I was your desire, acting strange lately, trying to drive my love away. I'm cutting out on you, baby. Girl, I'm going back up the line. If I stay another day, you're gonna do drop me out of my mind. Took me from my home, nothing but a child. Made all kinds of promises to me, and I know you were lying and driving. I'm cutting out on you, baby. Girl, I'm going back up the line.
So it is Monday, May 21st, and it's 2018 still. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we are now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, CKWE in Tyendinaga. You can find us streaming also at www.ltnradionet.com. And, of course, we're Facebook live streaming as well. We opened up with some Freight Train, and that was Up the Line. And just a second, I'm gonna bring on Robert Freight Train Parker. We're gonna talk about his trip out to Winnipeg and what that was all about. In case you don't recall, we had Robert joining us, kind of announcing his excitement about being nominated for with his first CD, Freight Train Live, being nominated for Best Blues Album at the Indigenous Music Awards, and he did very well out there in Winnipeg. So we'll talk about that in just a second. But first, I got to do something that I've been meaning to do. I got to give a shout out to one of my listeners, and that listener is Julia Rose White Pigeon. That's my granddaughter who listens to my show, and sometimes she listens to my show over and over and over again. And now I'm going to give her a reason to listen even more, because I'm giving her a shout out today. I know it's a little bit late. Hopefully she'll get to bed right away, but trust me, she'll listen to the show over again. And I appreciate that. This is the way we learn things. We learn by listening and then having a conversation about what we learn. So that's Julia Rose White Pigeon, my granddaughter. One of 9, and might be the only one of the 9 that actually listens to my show. So I got to give her that shout out. All right. Well, let me go ahead and reintroduce our return visit, my friend Robert Freight Train Parker. Robert, thanks again for joining me on my program.
Hey, thanks for having me, John.
All right. Let me see. Now I get a little bit of a feedback. Let me see if I can fix that up a little bit. Okay. I don't know if that's a little bit better. All right.
Technical problems, obviously,
Let me see. Try turning it down a little bit on the board here. Let me see if we can. Is that any better? Let me see.
Hello.
Well, let me. I'm gonna plug and unplug and see what happens here. Any better?
Yeah.
It's good for you, not so good for me on my side. Let me see. Hold on a second. Let me see. Geez, we usually got a great sound off of this. Usually it's the other side on that we have a problem with. But let me see.
Yeah. How's that?
No, it's not. Let me see. I'm not sure what to do here. Go ahead and try the plug up there, right there. Check that one there. Well, let's do the best we can, Robert. Let's see.
Yeah,
Well, first
yeah,
off,
of course.
you went out to Winnipeg. You were nominated for the Best Blues Album of the Year at the
Right, right.
Indigenous Music Awards in Winnipeg, and lo and behold, you won. So first off, I want to I want to congratulate you, and
Thanks,
if you
thanks.
could give me a little bit of I mean, I know you don't do the awards thing. That's not kind of what you're into, but I know somebody recommended that you do this, and you did it, and you got to be feeling pretty good about this.
I'll tell you what, I was honored because of this, the specifics that is the Indigenous Music Award, and what really made it all the better was the win was it's industry people selected me as selected this album as the best album. It wasn't a popular vote, but when I had gone and quite honestly I didn't think I had a chance.
Well, I know there's are great blues artists in every one of our communities. So it is more competitive than people might think, because I mean almost every native territory has at least their local hometown band that is a blues band, and obviously some of them are quite good. Yours is an excellent band, and although it isn't a quote unquote reservation based band, obviously this whole area of Western New York, when you're a band that plays Buffalo, and you're tied to the Seneca Nation and the Seneca people, and of course there's Tuscarora, Tonawanda, and the Seneca Nation. I know that you perform at Seneca gaming venues fairly often,
Yep, yep.
and of course you're a constant in the nightlife of Buffalo. You're pretty much playing every weekend from what I gather.
Every week, oh, and more, and I went out there with the intention of just maybe just making connections. They had a really good music conference for 2 days, and I got to meet a lot of industry people from Canada, and there was people representing from everywhere, South America, New Zealand, and there's record people, agencies, everything, and you could actually sit down and talk with them. And then Friday came around, and that was the award night, and I get ready. I thought, hey, this is great. I'm having a nice time. And the first award was, and the show started. Monberry from Six Nations was the presenter. She comes out and opens the envelope, and lo and behold, spells my name. And I was really, I was kind of shocked. I was kind of like, whoa. I stood up, and I did not have anything prepared to say my thank yous, and so that was all pretty much off the cuff. It was a great feeling. It was, I never expected it, and it's open doors already, really, to be known as to have that record, my first nomination, my first record, and my first award,
Well, it is again. It is. It's. I'm glad that you. Well, I'm glad you were nominated. I mean, that in of itself, I think, is an honor. But the idea that you went out there, perhaps not expecting. I mean, just again, expecting to enjoy the event and be a part of it, and then to walk away with the award is just phenomenal. I wish for some reason our audio isn't sounding great, so we'll have to have you back, and I'd like to get back in studio and we'll talk to you more about this Red Shade of Blues show that I want to talk about. So, but
why don't we just set a date? Get a hold of me, and I'll make the drive out there.
Yeah, we'll do that. Robert Freight Train
Right.
Parker, I want to thank you so much for being a part of the show. I wish my audio was a little better. I don't know what something must have gone wrong on my board here or something, at least on the audio inputs. But thank you very much, and we'll catch up. I'll see you in town.
Yes, sir. Yes,
and
sir.
we'll get together again.
Okay. Yeah.
That is Robert Freight Train Parker, good friend of mine, and friend of the show. and I can't say enough about how good his music is. We've been playing quite a bit of it as we go through the I don't know, as we go through our show on a week by week basis. We try to mix up a bunch of native music, and his is among the music that we just love to play. So again, I'm thrilled to death to see that not only was he nominated for such an award, but that he won the award. And I was thrilled to see his wife post up that he won it. That was just great. So again, congratulations to Robert Freight Train Parker, and his band Freight Train. They do play locally. I mean, if you just go to his website, you can find where they're playing next, and they do play. They play often, and they play in venues all over South Buffalo and Buffalo. So by all means, do yourself a favor and go out and see Freight Train. Just a great sound. Obviously, we play some of his music here, and you will get to sample some of that as we go through the show some more. Hey, look, I've got to present something that we rarely talk about. And we talk about resistance. In fact, one of the expressions we use is that we say that our existence is the resistance. The fact that we're even here is not just a demonstration of the resistance that we've always demonstrated, but the fact that we continue to exist as a distinct people, fighting for sovereignty, asserting our sovereignty in many ways, in many of the ways that we can, or in any way that we can, in some cases. But we rarely talk about, and I've got a couple of friends who sometimes ask me, if we got everything we wanted, what would we have? Where would we be? And coming out of so much attention with Malcolm X, celebrating this past week, and even looking back at MLK, and you think about the "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, Martin Luther King, that's among the most famous speech, and it's been used, heck, it's been used by the the white community, I guess, as much as it has by any of the black community. And what the "I Have a Dream" speech talks about, it's not "I have a plan." It's not like, what we're gonna do to get there necessarily. What King talks about in that speech is what he envisions it will be when they get there, when we get there, when we have the success, when the fight is over, if such a thing ever does happen. But when you get to that destination that you've been fighting for, what do you have? And of course, the most memorable line from that is that his children will be judged by the content of the character, not by the color of skin. I'm afraid, Martin, we didn't get there yet. We just haven't gotten there yet. But I want to talk about us. So where is it that we get to? When we fight for our sovereignty, and we fight for indigenous rights, and we fight for environmental issues, and we fight the state, and we fight the federal government, we fight Canada, we fight the provinces. Sometimes we fight each other. What is it that we want? Where do we want to see ourselves? And I want to lay a few things out that are on my wish list. Some of the things that I'd like to see, and they may not necessarily always be what you think they're going to be. I mean, a lot of people, when they talk about, what will we get when we get what we want, and some people talk about reparations. Some people talk about, land claims and getting, all our land back or some of our land back and that kind of thing, and as if we're going to fight to get it back, and that's not necessarily where I place the highest value. Some people think that we should fight for more rights within the U.S. Constitution. We should fight to have more people in office, and state offices, and federal offices, and provincial offices, and in Canadian Parliament. I mean, UN ambassadors. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of things that other people talk about, and some of them are pretty lofty. And so when we talk about what it is we want and where we would like to be, and what we're really fighting for, sometimes I'm not sure that we all know. But I want to throw a few things out. Obviously, one of the things that I talk a lot about is native to native trade. So for me, part of the fight that I have with not just New York State, but the states themselves, and of course the federal government, is their failure and the refusal to acknowledge that we have a right to have our own economies on our territories that we control. Even if part of that economy involves some of their people coming onto our territory, it's still our economy. Because they're quick to say, once you leave the territory and you enter in our commerce stream, you're subject to our laws. But they don't want to reciprocate. They don't want to suggest, okay, when our people go onto your territory, then our laws don't apply to them there. Regulatory stuff. I mean, I'm not even talking about criminal jurisdiction stuff. I'm talking about just regulatory issues. So we have a lot of difficulty in asserting not only to the states, but to the federal government and frankly even in the international community, our rights to have commerce that is distinctly ours, and specifically the native to native commerce. And I'm not even talking about international commerce, our ability to trade with other countries. But these are among the things that when you say them, some people would say, you mean you can't? You mean you can't buy something, as a people from another country? Hell, we're in a place now where we can't even travel to another country without the United States or Canada saying, well, you got to have a U.S. or a Canadian passport. So, again, these are some of these are the easy things to mark off. Travel documents. I mean, there's no reason that we can't have our own travel documents. So that's one of the things that I think we should be able to check off. And you know what? Shame on the international community for not stepping up. I mean, it's fine to pass the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and make that declaration about what is the minimum standard that the world has embraced as the rights for Indigenous people. But how many countries are even meeting that minimum standard? Certainly the U.S. and Canada aren't, nor is Australia. I mean, we can go right down the list. Every country that refuses to accept a Haudenosaunee passport or any of our travel documents, and we sometimes talk about the Haudenosaunee passport because there aren't a whole lot of native travel documents that are out there, but we should all have them. I mean, the Seneca Nation should issue its own passports, or some variation of a travel document that the international community accepts. And these aren't high bars. These should be easy things to knock off. And we can even work them within some sort of international standard for travel documents. I mean, I'm not saying that we've got to, just get a U.S. passport with our own logos on it. I don't want to go there. I think we should be able to control the information that goes into a passport. Now, I'm not saying other countries can't access that information. That's kind of the whole point, right? But I think these are the things that we should be able to fight for. But international trade and native to native trade are among those things that we really should press. And there's no reason for it not to be respected. I mean, if you talk to most Americans, even Americans who are in elected office. I mean, I only got to go back a few years when George Maziarz, who was a prominent Western New York Republican state senator, and Tim Kennedy, who was an up-and-comer on the Democratic side, these guys both sent letters to Tom Maddox from the New York State Office of Revenue and Finance and said, look, we don't believe that the state has the authority to interfere with native to native trade. I mean, they said it. And in fact, they talked about how, any effort of the state to interfere with that would have dire financial consequences, not only for the native territories that are around the areas that they represent, but it impacts their constituencies too. And it does. So, I mean, part of the whole thing is about understanding that our sovereignty is an asset for us, right? I mean, it is one of those assets that we can list that could help our businesses. Right? When I say sovereignty, I mean our regulatory advantages, low taxes or no taxes, streamline efforts to put up a building. Our we don't have the same kind of code enforcement issues and the same permitting processes that can take years and years. Environmental evaluations can be done quickly. We can do things much easier and faster on our territories, and we don't have the regulatory burdens or the financial burdens associated with those regulations for us to build a business on our territories. And of course, there are other regulatory advantages that we have. We would argue that there's laws that don't apply on our territory that may prohibit businesses off territory. Hemp farming, for instance, comes to mind. Even beyond the cannabis and the recreational stuff and medical stuff, just straight hemp. That's something that frankly, I'm surprised more native territories aren't doing it. Just do it, and we'll. And of course, there's a fight involved. These are some, but if we accomplish what we would like to accomplish in our fight to assert sovereignty, then that would not have to be the cost of doing business, fighting the state on every turn, fighting the federal government on every turn. And see, this is when somebody asks, well, what would we have if we got what we wanted? And it would be cooperation. We would have a situation where townships and counties and states and the federal government themselves would look at our territories not as places that are sucking money out of their tax base, but that we are a breeding ground and a testing area for new technologies, for innovation, for emerging industries, or industries that would just not be viable because of the overhead associated with doing something in a very overtaxed state or an overtaxed region. So then you create a model. You say, okay, well, yeah, maybe that doesn't work in Erie County, but you know what? It does work on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation because you stripped away some of the stuff. And now, what does that send as a signal back to municipal leaders? They might say, okay, so look, this wasn't viable here until these guys could strip some of that away, and now it is viable, and it creates a revenue. Maybe there's a different way to think about how you create revenue for an area, and not to mention that the regional impact of our success. And of course, when we talk about native to native trade, what that enables us to do is to not only use our regulatory advantages in an area that may have a great consumer market, like our territories that have major metropolitan areas around them, but it allows us to do trade with places that may not have that same advantage. Maybe it's a Pine Ridge that is a very desolate and very impoverished area, but there may be other attributes that they can bring to the table. And even if they can't, just the idea that we would do native to native trade could provide income and meaningful support, because the world's gotten to be a smaller place when it comes to manufacturing or looking for the regulatory advantages that one territory may have over another. But if we had that kind of element of trade, free trade between native territory and native territory, we could help lift up struggling economies because some of us have territories that again have a larger consumer market nearby. Because the thing is, in spite of the fact that I oftentimes talk about racism and the unique racism that applies to native people or that native people experience, I got to say something. For the most part, non-native people like us. There is an affinity towards native products, towards to our culture. Now, that's not to say that there are a lot of white people don't think that we're beneath them, which is where the racism comes in, right? Because racism is about power and superiority, inferiority. There's a fair amount on the hard, right who just don't like anybody of color or anybody who's a little bit different than white people. But that's you're going to have that. But in general, most people, including politicians, I don't think that we are received badly. I just don't think that people have a strong sense that we not only have something to contribute to their existence, I guess, to their economies and everything else, but that we have something to offer that they don't have themselves. And it's funny because people saw it in gaming, right? Gaming casinos weren't allowed in New York State. Other than lotteries, that was it, or church bingos, not charity gaming and that kind of stuff. And what native people proved is that there's a gaming market, and there's not only a gaming market that can wean native territories and native peoples off of so much of the government assistance that they had gotten. It could help lift them out of poverty. It could help create jobs for native and non-native, but it also put money back into the states in a variety of ways, not just through revenue sharing. So I'm not even going to go down that road, but through many other means. I mean, let's face it. The vast majority of people who work in our gaming facilities are non-native, and they pay taxes, state taxes, federal taxes. They buy houses, they pay sales tax, they pay all these taxes. So all that stuff is a boon for the state. So, but nobody seems to assess that. Even when the Seneca Nation throws numbers out there and say, well, Seneca Gaming adds $4 billion to the Western New York and New York economy per year, or whatever that number is. I don't think people get it. They don't understand, well, what does that even mean? I mean, what does it mean to say you add money to an economy? But if you break it all down, you realize, no, there's revenue. There are people who have nothing to do with gaming that benefit from the revenue that is generated, and the employment that is generated, and and the vendor employment that is generated, all of that stuff. So I mean, this is, if we had, if we could achieve what we're fighting for, we would have cooperative relationships with the counties and with the townships and the state and the federal government, and rather than, I'm not saying everything we would do with the state or the counties or the towns or the federal government's blessing, but there may be some things that the federal government and the state government say, you know what, we aren't going to allow our people to do this, but you guys are in a unique situation, so let's, we encourage you to do something. That's kind of what happened with gaming, right? We encourage you to do something, and you know what? And if you're successful, maybe we'll get in that business, which is exactly what happened with gaming. Whether you like it or not, that's what happened with gaming. But what if medical tourism? What if certain medical treatments? What if we started offering certain things on our territories that weren't available anyplace else in the state, or maybe even anyplace else in the country, because we could get the state to embrace what we do. I mean, there are doctors in New York State. There's some great technology that comes right out of Western New York that that brain trust gets sold off to other countries. There are practicing doctors in this country who won't do certain surgeries here, but they'll go do it in the Cayman Islands. They'll go do it in Aruba. They'll go to other countries. They'll go to Israel or Germany or whatever else, and they'll perform certain surgeries and certain procedures in other countries because they are prohibited in the United States, even though they're American doctors, or they're doctors who are working in American hospitals. So what if we offered that? Well, what if something could happen on our territories that can't happen in Buffalo? Cancer treatment, stem cell stuff that still just hasn't emerged in the industry, but will. So our territories could be, if our sovereignty was respected, and if the idea of somebody coming onto our territories, that they could be indemnified when they went home. I mean, if a doctor, goes to another country and performs a surgery and comes home, their license isn't in jeopardy. But right now, I think if a doctor came onto a native territory and was a part of a clinic that offered something, I think the state and federal government would be all over them. So these are among the things that I think when you ask, what is it that we could do? What can we do that's something that's different? That isn't just gas, gaming, and cigarettes. I mean, we've proven something with those three industries. I mean, we've backwards integrated in the tobacco industry from not just selling, premium brands, but to manufacturing, and manufacturing with high standards, and meeting some of the federal requirements. We have accomplished great things, and when I say we, I mean Native people. I don't mean just tribal governments necessarily, because that's the other thing. Understanding that we have a vibrant private sector that may have dollars to invest to do certain industries that the Seneca Nation, or the United Nation, or the Mohawks, or the Onondagas, or the Navajo, anybody else may not want to get involved in, but the private sector may. But again, if we could accomplish what we wanted to accomplish in fighting for our sovereignty, then our nations, or the governments that are that represent our territories and our peoples, would not be so averse to uh, to casting out their sovereignty net, I guess, and shrouding, letting the nation's sovereignty, or our sovereignty, protect the private sector. And you see, this is the way. I mean, look, this is the way business is done every place else in the world. If you have a territory that's got regulatory advantages, they market it. If you've got a town or a county that has a regulatory advantage or any kind of advantage, if that advantage just happens to be you have cheap electric because you got a hydroelectric dam within a couple miles of you. If you've got obviously if you've got great weather, that's that's an advantage that you have. That's a market advantage. The problem is that our market advantages that are associated sometimes with the unique characteristics of our territories and our regulatory advantages, we aren't allowed to market those advantages without a fight from the state, from local governments, from the state. I mean, we got a bunch of friends down there in Mahwah, New Jersey, who can't even assemble more than 2 or 3 people at a time for a prayer circle, for crying out loud, without local municipalities crying foul. So this is the kind of stuff that I and we'll talk more. We're at the bottom of the hour, so let me take a break here. But when we come back, again, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that I think that we could introduce if our sovereignty were respected. If we got what we wanted, what we're always fighting for, what would it look like? We'll talk more about it when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I'll be right back.
Another day you're going to drop me out of my mind.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. Let's Talk Native. And, we are talking here, and we're talking about something that isn't talked about much, and that is what we would have if we got what we wanted. And, look, I'm in the fight as much as anyone. I'm fighting for our sovereignty and our autonomy and our distinction. I talk about it all the time. Those are the 3 words I always put together. But if we got that, if our distinction was acknowledged, if our autonomy was acknowledged, if our sovereignty was respected, what would we have? Well, I think what we have is an opportunity to develop economically, but we'd also have to think beyond that. I think one of the things we'd have to have is the means for solving conflict that go beyond state and federal courts. Right now, I mean, I remember when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was first passed by the United Nations. United States voted against it. They were one of 4 countries that voted against it. And in 2010, there was a series of meetings, and I went down to it. In fact, Ross, John, and I went down to these consultations, as they called it, on revisiting the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the question kept being raised about the federal government being concerned that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples would somehow change international law, and that it would disrupt the current remedy that existed for conflict between Native people and the federal government. And they kept saying that. So when we got a chance to ask questions, I said, what is this current remedy you're talking about? And they said their courts. So as far as the federal government is concerned, their court system was the remedy for our conflict with them and their court system, which obviously is problematic. Now, so we have this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples out there, and it's got a lot of words to it. It's got a lot of articles to it. And although it does suggest that it is the minimum standard for survival and dignity of Native people, it doesn't say how that minimum standard should be enforced or asserted. So there's no bite to it. There's a lot of bark, and there's no bite. So one of the things I think we need is something beyond the U.S. courts and state and federal courts to resolve conflicts that we have. I mean, because here's the bottom line. By definition, a U.S. court cannot deal with issues that are outside of its constitutional framework. So if sovereignty is a question, then these courts can't rule on matters of sovereignty. The closest they can get is say, well, we either do or we don't have jurisdiction. And oftentimes, when they claim they have jurisdiction, they're just claiming it based on their laws, not on any kind of consent between the two parties to that jurisdiction. I mean, if you have one party says, no, you don't have jurisdiction on this stuff. This happened on Native territory, and you don't have jurisdiction here. And the court's saying, oh, yeah, we passed a law that says we do. Yeah, but you passed a law, but you passing a law isn't the same thing as us ever having consented to that, to that jurisdiction or that transfer of jurisdiction or sovereignty. So I think we need to have a fairer arbiter of justice and equity when it comes to conflicts that we have, specifically with U.S. law, with state law, and that may be U.S. corporations and state corporations, whatever. So I think if you ask what would we have if we got what we wanted, I think we'd have a different system for how we deal with issues. Now, to the extent that Native courts exist and state courts exist and federal courts exist, my view is, look, if there is a time and a place for a federal court or a state court to deal with an issue involving Native people, then how about parity? And when I say parity, what do I mean? What I mean is, well, how about where are the examples when we can bring the state or the federal government into our courts? So that's, to me, look, it's got to go both ways. Everything, the United States always wants everything unilateral, one way. One way, to make something work. We're going to enforce something against you, but we're not going to abide by the very things that we're trying to enforce against you. And that's what, if we ask what it is that we get, what do we get when we get what we wanted, that's what I would talk about. Equity. An equitable way with dealing with conflicts. And whether those conflicts involve a U.S. citizen committing a crime on our territories, or whether it's a state overreaching, police, a law enforcement overreaching, whether it's a court overreaching, we have to have some means. And the idea that we will take our case to the U.S. Supreme Court, that's still not our court. I mean, again, I hate to always kick this thing, but you've got a court that still is enforcing laws whose foundation lies with church dogma from the 15th century. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, liberal court justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, cited the doctrine of Christian discovery in footnote number 1 in 2005 a case involving the Oneidas trying to reclaim land that they purchased, and they just said, no, we're not going to pay tax on it. This is in our claim area. The courts have recognized that it's in our claim area, and so we purchased on the open market this land, and we're taking it back. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, no, you can't do that. On the doctrine of discovery, the land title came to us. First to the discovering European nations, and then to the states, and then to the United States. Wait a second. You just cited a Vatican, a papal bull, a Vatican doctrine as the basis for negating our right to have hold title to land. So, again, I think in order for us to get what we need, we've got to have, some equity in the applicability of our courts versus state and federal courts, and where there is no applicability of those, of those systems, then a system that we can agree upon. Now, and I don't mean just an arbitration. I mean the American Arbitration Association, which is going to be filled with a bunch of white men in black robes anyway, but perhaps an international tribunal, something, through an international court of some sort. So I think that's what has to exist. Now, the other thing, and Seneca Nation has begun the process of this, which is to suggest that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, although it is the minimum standard for indigenous rights as determined by the international community, that should at least be the baseline. Now, and I'm not saying that we accept that the baseline is where we're all at. I think that's the baseline for that minimum standard, right? But above that, we have certain things that not only do nation states of the world have to acknowledge for indigenous peoples, but we have some things that go beyond that, well beyond that. Sovereignty is not mentioned anywhere in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's no place in this document that the word sovereignty comes up that applies to us. The only time sovereignty is mentioned in this thing is when they're talking about that this document is not intended to infringe upon the territory of sovereign states, meaning the nation states. So that's part of the limitations on this. And I understand that in order for this thing to be passed by all the nations of the United Nations, they could only create a minimum standard. But beyond that, we not only have treaties, but we have land title. We have the sovereignty that we have the right to assert, not because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People says it, because we never yielded that right. So when we talk about a minimum standard, we have to understand that Native peoples throughout history have had different relationships with not just the United States, but Great Britain and France and the Dutch and any number of European nations and other nations throughout the world. And if we have never ended those relationships, if certain standards like our sovereignty, one of the things that I say all the time is that there's no place in American history where the United States can say that we surrendered our sovereignty, that we transferred our sovereignty to the United States. Now, what the United States does, because of their system of jurisprudence, is they try to cite case law, and they'll try to apply a case out in Potawatomi territory here to the in Seneca territory. When we talk about the Atia case, for instance, what the Supreme Court used was a case called Moe, which is Moe versus the Confederated Tribes of the Blackfeet, and the Colville case, the Colville Reservation case. They try to cite two cases out there as grounds to make a ruling that would impact us here. Now, I understand how some of that can work, but you have to understand that each territory has distinction. So beyond that baseline that should be the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, beyond that minimum standard, we have standards that inch that relationship up. And by inching it up, I mean they do put us more on par and as equals with the states and with the federal government, with the provinces and that kind of stuff. And when I say equals, I don't mean, equals in terms of might or wealth or, or population or any of that stuff, but just that we have the same legal rights to represent ourselves as distinct peoples. So, I mean, if we talk about what we would have if we got what we wanted, part of the whole thing is just understanding that we have to have mutual respect. And although I think it's reasonable to suggest that we would do things in our territories that would not be, unethical, or immoral. I mean, I'm not saying that we get crack houses on our territory because we're sovereign. I'm not suggesting that. I think we have a level of responsibility that probably exceeds some of the societal norms of the United States. And I'm not saying that we need to impose our standards on the state or the federal government, but nor should they have to impose their standards on us. And I think we can have conversations about, okay, if we went down a path that the state has concern about. I mean, if we got into gun manufacturing and all of a sudden the state says, we can't have a bunch of people going onto your territory buying a bunch of guns and bringing, then yeah, I think we could have a reasonable conversation about that before we got into a major conflict. But again, if we do get into a conflict, if the state says no, we're not going to allow you to build an industry out of hemp, and we're not going to allow you to build the cottage industries associated with hemp, and we're not going to allow you to support cottage industries off your territory as it relates to hemp, well, then maybe that's a conversation we need to have, and maybe when push comes to shove, we need to sit in front of an international tribunal to sort it out. So I think the whole idea is to say we need to have a more equal relationship in terms of how we deal with things we don't necessarily agree with. I mean, there are all kinds of regulatory hurdles that exist in many states. In New York State, not the least of which is burdened by them, that make it very, very difficult. And that's why it is a tough place to do business. So if we streamline some of that on our territories, and perhaps some of the businesses that exist on our territories are not native businesses, but we provide an industrial park, that that medical offices could open up in, or that manufacturing could open up in, and perhaps these are industries that can't make it in New York State because of the tax burdens. Every time New York State talks about creating an empire zone, well, what if we had our own economic zones that we offered on our territories that not only supported native business, but they supported non-native businesses? And could those territories, could those people who come onto our territories to take advantage of that not be penalized by the state when they go home? See, these are the conversations that we never even get to. We're so busy fighting over gaming dollars or over tobacco, or the price of fuel. We're so busy fighting about these stuff, we never get past the meaningful things that we could do that could benefit not only our economies and other native to native economies, but that they could other things that could benefit regional development and prove out some concepts. Some of the concepts that happen when you do clean the slate and you do strip away some of the regulatory hurdles. Some of these things we'll just simply never know. So the idea of creating new markets and new products and new industries and new innovations, and doing it in a place that perhaps has a greater operating margin because again, we don't have property taxes, we don't have income taxes, we don't have some of the burdens that exist out there, some of the corporate regulatory systems that are out there. Look, our territories could not just be more successful for us, but they could be the breeding ground for other markets and for other concepts and for niche markets, cottage industries that could go across the state. We could develop better ways for marketing products. Like I said, the interesting thing is, even as I talk about the unique racism that Native people experience, as I sit here with my no mascot shirt on, the reality is there's a certain affinity that the non-Native people have towards us, and I don't mean just white people. I mean in general, Native people aren't viewed as as a terrible people, and there's much about our culture. Sometimes it gets appropriated inappropriately. I mean, it does get hijacked and manipulated. I mean, especially people get carried away with their new age spirituality and that kind of thing. But in general, I think most people, not just in the U.S. and Canada, but even if you look out in Europe, I mean, there are people in Germany that they do powwows out there. No Native people out there, just white people doing powwows because they're so intrigued by their perception of our culture. So there's actually a market for Native products and for Native industries and Native businesses. Having some sort of Native strategy, market strategy, is not a terrible thing for a product. I mean, that's why we've been appropriated so badly. That's why it was called Niagara Mohawk. It's a river, but it's also they had a Native person, and all those guys that was their emblem. Had a mohawk on it. There's cars, Pontiac. There's Tecumseh motors. There's all kinds of things that that our imagery, our names, our culture have been appropriated for marketing purposes. So we know that there's an affinity towards utilizing Native imagery and Native culture to market something. And everybody else has had more success doing that than Native people have. In fact, the first time we use it, somebody says, "Oh, yeah, see, they think it's inappropriate for somebody to appropriate their image, but look at that big Indian standing alongside the thruway. Look, how inappropriate is that?" Well, so it's crazy. It's fine. White people think it's hypocrisy when we call it out, but they also think it's hypocrisy if we use it ourselves. So again, there are some things that I think that we could do that would benefit not just Native commerce and Native people, but also it could benefit regions. Now, there's also things beyond just economic reasons. There are Native concepts in terms of restorative justice. There are Native views that we hold. The concept of 7 generations. This idea that we look beyond our own children, grandchildren, and great grandchildren. So we look to those people that'll come that will be our relatives, but those faces we'll never see. I'll tell you, we could get some of that concept to be embraced by the non-Native people. It could change the planet. I mean, it could literally change how we accept responsibility. But if you view yourself as somebody, that somehow this trip on Earth is just what you do until your afterlife, like this is almost a meaningless part of your spiritual journey, well, then it's real easy to exploit this and to destroy it. I mean, if you're a company that says, look, I'm going to make an investment in mineral extraction, which means I got to make all the money out of that mountain that I can as fast as I can, because I'm only going to be this corporate CEO or on this board for a 4 or 5 year term. I mean, and even the political, from the politics standpoint, it is hard for a political party to look beyond the next election cycle. All of that stuff is counterproductive. So there are Native concepts, including 7 generations. There are other Native concepts that the idea that really got kind of bastardized by Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence. The idea that we suggested that there are rights endowed by creation. Where this thing got hijacked was that these were white men who said that men were endowed with certain rights by the Creator, meaning their God. What we were talking about is that all things of creation, everything that has been created has a right to be here. So, I mean, look, I'm not trying to create a Disney version, a cartoon version of all things having spirit and all things having, orenda as it's been called. But no, we must acknowledge that if the world's evolution allowed something to exist, then we should understand what the value of that is. Now we could argue, okay, but what about cancer? Well, when I'm talking about a creature, not just a bacteria or a disease, but I mean, if you look at creation, and whether it's a living thing or an inanimate object, we have to understand that there's a value. There is a value in stone. When you look at what's happening in Hawaii, for instance, the completely different way the Kanaka Maoli view these lava flows, from the way the news covers it, the way developers and white homeowners. I mean, everybody's looking at this thing as a tragedy. Then you hear some Native Hawaiian people say, "No, this is Pele. This is Pele just showing us what she does." I mean, this is how the islands were born. This lava's has now flowed to the ocean. This is how the island grows. But there's a completely different view how Native people view some of these natural phenomenons. It's the idea of flowing with nature, not flowing against nature. The idea of throwing up a dam. The idea of building, skyscrapers. So, yeah, I know Mohawks walked the high steel. So did Senecas, and so did a whole lot of other Native people. But the whole idea of building structures that defy nature. Look, if you defy nature, then eventually gravity takes its toll. So, I mean, these are some of the concepts that I think that beyond what I think our territories could represent in terms of economic impact on, states and counties and municipalities, cities, if you will. But, there are other things that Native people, if we were embraced in a way. Look, I'm not saying we got to be put on a pedestal. And I'm not saying that we need to be afforded special privileges every place that we go. No, I'm not saying that. But our territories are our territories. And we have the right, and we will always fight for this right. And at some point, those that we're fighting against will realize that if we have the right, if we have the opportunity to develop what we, in a way that we think is appropriate, there might be some models there that work for them as well. That's what I wanted to talk a little bit about. And this is a subject we'll go more on as time goes on. But it's something that came to mind as I was, listening to another, playback of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Well, I've got a dream too. It's about where we'll be when we battle all this resistance. Look, we're wrapping it up. So let me go give a shout out to my sponsors. I didn't do that at the bottom of the hour, so I'll do it now. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises. I want to thank Legacy 420 in Tandanega. I want to thank some of my friends who contribute to the program from time to time. Guys like Ed Schindler and folks like Cynthia Trice and Roger Jock, Neville Spring. Look, all of you who contribute to the show, even the ones who have done so in the past, who may not do so anymore, you've helped us get here to our ninth year. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming, and thank CKWE again, the GWE, for simulcast and the rebroadcast of this show. I want to thank Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. I also want to thank all of you who share the show, whether you share the Facebook live stream, whether you share the SoundCloud audio, or whether you share the YouTube videos. And look, I've got to make an acknowledgement for all of you, the group pages that allow my show to be posted on. I want to thank you guys. I mean, obviously there's administrators for each one of these group pages, and if you allow my show to appear on your group, then it opens up more people to the message I'm delivering, and quite possibly to the conversations that impact the members of those groups as well. So I want to thank those the administrators for those Facebook group pages for allowing my show to be posted on your pages. And of course, I want to thank especially my wife Brenda for posting this show on many of those Facebook group pages. Look, going to New York this week. We're still in fund drive mode. I'm going to be pitching two of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's books, Loaded, the a book about the Second Amendment and all the real Indians died off and 20 other myths about Native Americans. So I'm going to be pitching that book as well as covering some of the issues that need to be covered. So that'll be in New York on WBAI. You can go to WBAI.org. That's Thursday from 10 till noon. So catch us on Thursday. And if not, I'll see you back here on Friday. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.